My guest today is Susan Ní Chríodáin. Susan Ní Chríodáin is a facilitator, leadership coach, podcaster, and award-winning author of Leading Beyond the Numbers, How Accounting for Emotions Tips the Balance at Work. She's also a former auditor, financial controller, and operations director who's worked in Kenya, Uganda, Switzerland, Australia, Ireland, and the UK. Susan's career has toggled between the private and public sector as well as across continents, and she channels this experience, including leading global teams, into her consultancy Beyond the Numbers, where she advocates for workplaces where people bring their full selves, balancing performance with well-being. Susan says, "When I wrote Leading Beyond the Numbers, I didn't set out to create another how-to business book. I wanted to explore something more human, and the question so many of us wrestle with at work. Why do my relationships at work feel so hard sometimes? Does anyone else struggle with this level of responsibility? What will it take to feel like myself at work again?" The book blends neuroscience, story, and lived experience to show how understanding our brains and bodies can help us lead with more empathy and connection, and how that shapes not just relationships, but performance and profit too. Susan Ní Chríodáin, welcome to Speech Bubbles.
Thank you. It's so lovely to hear someone introduce me by using their own words, some of mine, but you've just, I want to use that in future, Charlotte, what you've said, because it sums it up beautifully. And I know on the screen, my book can't be seen. I don't think it can. I can't. So here's my book.
Here's Susan's beautiful book. And we'll talk a lot about it in the next few minutes. So, Susan, I'm personally fascinated about your journey from accounting to management to consulting to podcasting to writing and all the series of reinventions that happened in between. But I'd love to dig in first to the neuroscience that you explored while you were writing Leading Beyond the Numbers. Tell us about what you learned about the brain and how that can help us think about how we show up at work.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I moved to Oxford and I was studying coaching. And I went on to do a brain and behaviour course, and it really just began to fascinate me about how little I knew about my brain. And I don't think I was alone. I think a lot of us go through life without ever really thinking about how our brains and bodies work. And I got into the work of a neuroscientist and psychologist, Lisa Feldman Barrett, who has the most amazing TED Talks if you want to kind of dip into neuroscience and books. And the fascinating thing for me was the link that she made between our emotions and the brain. So the way she explains it is we predict everything that's about to happen, because if we didn't predict we were going to fall off a cliff by getting too close, then it's too late. But it doesn't feel like a prediction. So even as I'm speaking, Charlotte, you're probably predicting the next word I'm going to reveal. And, and so I should have said say there, and that's a surprise because actually it didn't go in with your brain's prediction. And she calls surprises little moments of learning, because often it's in those surprises when we get the prediction wrong that we're learning something new. And I think when we think about autopilot and driving is often the example that's used. You get into the car, you start driving, and you're suddenly where you're supposed to be and you've kind of not really paid attention. That's just the brain taking care of it and predicting the moves, and you don't really have to be actively involved. Of course, if something happens and someone rear ends you, God forbid, but they may cut you off, then you start a whole host of predictions. And it's usually kind of that person, how dare they? As opposed to maybe just thinking, what if they're rushing to a medical emergency? And I think so we can play with our predictions. And for me, that was the most fascinating part, Charlotte, was just because my brain thinks it, it doesn't make it true. And it's the same with emotions. Just because I feel something and give it a meaning, it doesn't make it true. And I can change my predictions.
Oh, I love that. And does that play into the idea that at work we think people are going to behave in a certain way. We make predictions about them. We're already starting to get gloomy and depressed. And actually, we have to train ourselves not to over-predict.
So, like, perfectly thought through, because I think we spent a lot of time, like you said, our first impression becomes always the impression. And if you know yourself, I mean, I've certainly had this, people that I've worked with years ago who have a certain lens at how they look at me or I will at them. And it's based on a point in time. And we're kind of doing them a disservice as well as ourselves. And I like the way you frame it in personal responsibility, because Charlotte, I think we have massive personal responsibility towards how we show up at work. And it's so easy to land it on the other person rather than take responsibility for how we react to the situation.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about accounting for emotions. So you talk about that a lot in the book, and I think it's such an interesting combination of where you come from, logic and numbers, but also the role of emotions at work. And if you could also talk about how empathy and connection connect with profit and performance.
Ooh, let's see if I can remember all of that. But accounting, I think accounting basically means telling a story. That's what you're giving, an account of something. And the language of accountancy happens to be in numbers. And what I really wanted to do was, when people kind of poo-poo soft skills and say they've no place in the workplace, was to use the language of business, which is often accounting, to talk about value and profit and things like that. So that's where I came up with the idea of accounting for emotions. And it was from Lisa Feldman Barrett's book, because she talks about this concept of body budgeting. And when I heard or read about body budgeting, it just pinged, and I couldn't let that accounting for emotions go. And I also like to think about, if you work in business, which probably most people here will do, even if it's non-profit, it's still a business. Everything is based around the financial statements and budgeting and all of that. And we think of the balance sheet as something to be afraid of or not to really understand. And it really helps if you can understand the push and pull, that we can't make profit at any cost, that losses are okay. Maybe not losses all the time, but a loss isn't necessarily a failure, because if we think of it in ourselves, we have to sleep. We have to eat. They're all expenditures, and sometimes they're bigger than what we're bringing in. So I like to use the balance sheet to talk about life. I use assets as our sense of aliveness and our energy. I say that we owe our life to death, so death becomes our liability. And then the equity part, which is often the shareholders' funds, is more about, well, actually, what makes me me? What would I like to profit from? And if we can balance that, because often balance we think of as very like 50-50, and of course it's still 50-50, but this gives three ways to look at the equation, and I liked that, as opposed to just either or. There's more of an expansiveness to that. And then empathy and connection. And I suppose I'm not the biggest fan of empathy, Charlotte, and I'll explain what I mean. I think empathy is extremely important, but I don't think that we can ever really put ourselves in someone else's shoes and imagine life from their perspective, because the way we make predictions, like we talked about earlier, is from our own experience, our own backgrounds, our own learnings along the way. So even for me to try and imagine what it was like for you to write your book, I can't, because I'm imagining from my perspective. And, you know, you grew up in South Africa, I grew up in Ireland. Okay, we're women, maybe we have that in common, but maybe that's all it is. And I think we spend a lot of time with empathy thinking, well, if I just imagine what it's like to be in their shoes, I'll understand, but we don't. And so I think that we always have to consider compassion. Because I think compassion calls us to understand. Having empathy is that first step, but actually asking, Charlotte, what was it like for you to write your book? As opposed to me thinking about what it was like for you. And then, of course, connection is everything in the workplace, anywhere. We're humans. We all share that in common. And I know I said we can't imagine what it's like for anyone else, but no, I've been to a lot of the world. Been lucky enough. And I'm always astounded about how much we have in common, how people want their kids to be educated. They want the best thing for them. They want a house. They want, education is always so important. So there are some things that we share as a human race that without that connecting, we don't see it and we other people.
Yeah. I love that. It's such a great answer. What was coming up for me as you were speaking was, first of all, remembering being a manager. And without having the language that you've used, I think I tried to err towards compassion rather than empathy, but also mixed in with respect. So compassion for somebody else's experience, but also respect for where they're coming from and their opinions. I did want to pick up on the metaphor of your body is your budget, did you say?
Body budgeting, yeah.
Body budgeting, because what came up for me there was I have become, since leaving corporate, very obsessed with my sleep. And I think that's part of my body budgeting, is making sure that I get enough sleep every day so that I can get up and be a good author, podcaster, consultant, parent, wife, friend, and all the other parts of my life.
Yeah, sleep, exercise, and our eating and hydration. And I don't mean like you have to go and run a marathon or any of those things, but those things are really central to our body budget, because if you're sitting at a desk all day, you're just running on that part, and we're a whole system. We need to use more than just our bums on seats. And we often focus on using our brains. And sometimes even just getting up from your desk and moving, well, that gives your brain new predictions as well. So there's like a double effect. If you walk up and down the stairs, you're getting some exercise. And of course, without sleep, nothing works properly. And we fool ourselves into believing it does, but it doesn't. And the sleep science research out there is phenomenal.
Yeah, it certainly is. So, Susan, you've recently won an award in the leadership category of the very prestigious Business Book Awards in the UK. Congrats. How does that feel?
Thank you. Yes, I was bowled over, Charlotte, to win the highly commended. I have it sitting on my desk as a constant reminder. It's kind of hard to see, but
what a beautiful thing.
And it was a shock. Like, it really was a shock. And last week we were in London. There was the Practical Inspiration Authors Day, and I know we didn't manage to meet on Thursday, but we were both there, and we did a session on the rewards of awards. And something I really learned about the process, Charlotte, is it's fantastic to have recognition and credibility and all of that, but if you don't have it in yourself, all the external stuff out there isn't going to validate how you feel. And that was quite an interesting journey for me as well, because I battled with, do I even go to the shortlisting? Because I might not get shortlisted, and convinced myself to go, and then went on to actually win an award. But there's something about, I brought 2 medals with me, because I also won another award, Next Generation Indie Book Award, and that came with a beautiful silver medal. So I brought that with me last week. And actually, I also brought a half marathon medal, because for me, the half marathon medal is so meaningful, because I did that. It was something I kind of pushed myself at. I didn't get the reward from someone else. It was something I earned to just me. And I think that's the difference. We often outsource our sense of validation or worth to awards. And I think that's a dangerous, or promotions or whatever it might be. And it's often a dangerous road, and it starts with you. So I think believe in yourself, and and stay true to yourself is what I would say to people. Easier said than done in a society that doesn't always value us, but yeah.
Yeah, lovely advice, and really important for me as I'm coming out of kind of the pointy end of book marketing since June 2025 and getting more into the sort of second stage, where sometimes you feel quite alone. You feel like it's just me in this book, and I'm knocking on doors and I'm trying to persuade the world to take notice, but actually to take time to step back, to thank yourself, award yourself, say, hey, well done, you actually did this.
Absolutely.
So important. I love meeting other writers, and I love talking about the book writing and marketing process, two very different processes. Talk to me about what writing felt like and then what the marketing process felt like.
Oh, the writing was quite a battle to get started. A lot of self-doubt, a lot of, will anyone ever read this? Will anyone care? And something I did, and I write about it in the book, is I went with my circadian rhythm. And this is like, so we're full of rhythms, and the circadian rhythm is to work for 90 to 120 minutes and then take a break, at least 20 minute active break. And what I found was once I got into that, because it's natural, the body's either going to start yawning or need to go to the toilet, all of these things, and we override it often. So I started to tune into that rhythm, and after a while I was able to do 4 of them in a day. And once I got into that, I very much immersed myself in the writing. And when it went to the book development editor, I was kind of petrified of what I was going to get back. And what the book development editor, there was plenty to work with, but one of the things they said to me was, this book is going to help people. It's written in your voice. It's very warm. It's, there's humor, all of that. And I was like, okay, somebody sees me. Someone actually sees in this raw mess, somebody sees. And that was like fuel then. It really was. So that kind of fed, I'm doing the right thing, or I'm going in the right direction. Yeah. So there's a lot involved, and thank God in one way for deadlines, because then it's done. It may not have ever finished otherwise. And the marketing promotion side, it's funny because, you do think like, oh, suddenly something's going to change because I've got a book out in the world. And it's kind of naive because we know there's so many books. And I really learned that I was faced with myself again. And unless I was talking about it, then who else would be? And of course, people send you messages and all of that, and that's wonderful. But the marketing is hard. The promotion is hard. I think it's hard, at least. It's maybe not that hard, but it's not my favourite aspect of having a book in the world.
Yeah. I completely understand that. I was kind of looking forward to the marketing, having been alone with the book for several months. And then I enjoyed it at first, and then my body budget fell down and I was exhausted and I needed a really, really big break. And another author had warned me. She said, make sure you schedule in at least 2 weeks where you switch off 100% from the book and from all the marketing, because otherwise you're going to exhaust yourself. And I'm glad I listened to her.
Good advice, yeah.
So, Susan, your career has been a series of reinventions. You started as an accountant at Deloitte in Ireland, and you're now quite far from that. Give us a potted history of your career, and I'm particularly interested in what you call the best job I never got.
So yeah, I did. Like you said, I started out in accounting. I went from Deloitte in Dublin to Australia, like a lot of people were doing at the time. And I worked for quite a big organisation, the equivalent of Bupa in the UK, if people are familiar with that. And I came back to Ireland and I knew I wanted to go and live and work in Africa. So then I volunteered with an Irish aid agency, and I worked in Uganda for a couple of years, in Kenya for a couple of years, mostly in accounting, but mostly to do with people as well, because like everything when you're in a job, it's got to do with the people you're working with. And I traveled a lot, and it was a fantastic, absolutely fantastic career. And then I got sick of living out of a suitcase, and I moved back to Ireland again, but relocated to the UK quite quickly and became the director of finance of the Mines Advisory Group, which was it's a Nobel Peace Prize winning organisation that clears landmines and unexploded ordnance around the world. I was 33, Charlotte, so I was quite young, naive, which probably was the best combination at the time for the job, because it was a huge job I took on. Not alone just in the scope, but the fact that everything was out of date, banking, procedures, donor reporting. They were in trouble with donors. There was a lot to fix. And the job, I would say, was the making and the breaking of me. So it took a lot out of me, but also gave me a lot. And I took a break then, went back to university and studied nationalism and ethnic conflict. And then now for something completely different. I needed a break, you know, I wanted to learn about identity. I was very fascinated with identity. And from there, I applied for a job in Switzerland. And this is the job you're alluding to. And it was, again, a finance director or CFO role. And I didn't get it. And I came down to the last two, and it was given to somebody else, but they offered me work. And that was phenomenal, because I got to take another job, and then after a few months move out of finance and into broader management leadership. And in the end, my last 3 years there, I was the director of country operations. And so I had 5 country directors in Asia and 5 in Africa reporting into me, as well as 2 members of staff in Geneva. And that was an incredible job. I absolutely loved it. And from there, I relocated to the UK with my partner and decided to begin my own journey of working for companies of my choosing for lengths of time of my choosing, which is very different.
Yeah. Well done, by the way, on that potted history. That was exceptionally short and well managed. Excellent live editing, and I watched your brain in action as you did it.
Thank you.
So, Susan, where have you learnt the most about leadership? And because you talked about having those very, very senior folks reporting to you, and what did you learn about leadership in that role?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose from earlier I learned that we can only lead people by being with them. And I learned a lot about leadership from very poor managers and leaders, and saw in them that stuff I would never do. And a horrible way to learn in one way, Charlotte, but also great learning that there is another way. And I had to ask for help. I had to ask for help very early on, which I think, and also say, I don't know. And for me, leadership is very much about the ability to say, I don't know. So by the time I got to lead very senior people, I suppose I was a lot more, I was 40, in my 40s now. And so I was a lot more relaxed into myself. I'd had the shocks along the way, and the bumps and the warts and the celebrations. And I knew they were technical people. So it was a nutrition organization, and most of the people I was leading were very technical, very senior. I knew nothing about nutrition, but I didn't need to, because they were running a country office, they were managing teams, they were managing budgets, they were managing operations, all of that kind of thing. And so I listened, and that's what I learned about leadership. Leadership is about listening. It's not about telling. It's not about shouting. It's not about any of those kind of archetypal things we might think of. Yes, there has to be directing at times, of course, but it's a collaboration, and being able to walk alongside someone and watch them shine, for me, is leadership, because it was never about me. It was about them having the support that they needed, and me helping fight their battles when no one would listen.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is listening, being a directive only when necessary, and fighting battles for your team, which I really, really love. But the thing that struck me the most is the power and the liberation that's inherent in saying, I don't know. Because so many leaders think they have to have the answer. I did when I first became a leader. I thought I had to know everything. So I'd love
maybe we all do when we start, though, Charlotte, because no one tells you you don't need to know.
Yeah, and maybe that's, a wonderful theme that's coming out of today's talk is like the power of, it's quite vulnerable as well for a leader to say, I don't know everything, or maybe we work it out together, or you tell me, but there's a lot of power in that, which I really love.
I think there's like something about sitting in meetings, Charlotte, and I did so many sitting in meetings where people, you can tell they're making it up or pretending they get it. And so often when somebody would say something that I could see in a room people didn't get, I would say something like, can you say more about that? So that person would also explain themselves when they did understand it, or somebody else could jump in and explain it in a way. Because I think we spend a lot of time thinking we're alone in not understanding something. And then when you offer up, I don't get it, or I don't understand you, it's license for others to get it.
Yeah, which is lovely. And so how have you parlayed all that leadership experience in what you do now as a consultant?
Yeah, so it varies, because I do quite a bit of facilitation, because that's what I found I enjoyed a lot. Was I love reading a room. I love setting the scene for a room, and I love unpacking things with people and teasing things out. And I was lucky enough to get to do a lot of that at my workplace, and so it seemed like a natural way to go when I left. And also coaching. So I coach senior leaders, and it's just like my previous job, except now it's a different now because I'm not in the organization with them. But there's something about helping people see how amazing they are and let their eyes shine, make sure that they're doing the right things for them, not always the organization, because if there's too much of a mismatch, that's not going to work. And I get to do like different pieces of work as well. So I'm quite open to what comes my way. And so, for example, at the moment, I'm doing something on a piece of conservation work where
lovely.
There's a guy who's running the grounds of a garrison here nearby Oxford. And he's civil service, he's ex-army. And there's somebody wanting to fund the conservation work. And they want to get the priorities out of this person for what he wants and what he sees as the priority. And so I'm facilitating that conversation. And it's really interesting because I'm not sure how much of a long-term vision is, to try and tease these things out sometimes takes a lot of tools and a lot of thinking and a lot of back and forth. And it's just a joy to do it as well.
Oh, it sounds like a lovely gig, actually. So, Susan, you've worked in many different cultures and countries. I wondered what diversity means to you.
Yeah, it's interesting, Charlotte, because growing up, I grew up in a very small rural place where every single person was white. Mm-hmm. Most of them were, probably 99% of them were Catholic. A lot of them were related to me. A lot of them did the same things like fishing, farming, and so on. So I had no idea that there were other people in the world almost until I started to, travel myself. And I think, I know they say it's a cliche that travel broadens the mind, but there is nothing like travel to broaden the mind. And it's the best education. I think you will learn more by being at the edge of what is comfortable for you, of having to cope where there isn't a language that you have, of all of these wonderful things that travel brings. But not just travel, I suppose, surviving in another country, working in another country, and so on. So what that does, that gave me a diversity of experience, a diversity of outlooks. And that's what I value as well. I want people around me who think differently, who'll challenge the way I think, that we can disagree with each other and find another way. And nobody holds the same opinion, really, at the end of the day, or has the same background, or can make connections between different things. We need everybody. And I often think of the world like a jigsaw puzzle. And if we were all in the right places, in inverted commas, we would create this beautiful piece of art. And that's what we need. We need all the shapes and sizes, the corners and everything in the middle. And diversity is that. Diversity is strength.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I also, what was coming up as you were talking, when you talked about the importance of disagreement, and it's something I talk about in We Need New Leaders, which is this idea that creative abrasion of disagreement in a team is what leads to innovation. In order to have that, you need to have genuine psychological safety, not fake-ass psychological safety. But if you really get a diversity of voices around the table, you're going to get to such better outcomes.
It's incredible, isn't it? And that psychological safety, absolutely, Charlotte, you need to have that. You need the ability to disagree with one another and not take it. This is back to taking personal responsibility, because if you take everything as an attack, as opposed to taking a pause and actually saying, well, how can I help here? Or what's my role in this? And it can be done. And it's extraordinary when it works.
Yeah, it really, really is. And thank you for making that neat segue back to the top of the podcast, where we talked about taking responsibility and not sensing yourself as a victim in the situation. I think that's really, really important at work. So Susan, as a writer, an author, a podcaster, a consultant, how do you think about your own reputation?
You know what, Charlotte? I thought about, well, why give my own view of my reputation? And if you'd allow me, I'd like to read something out from a former colleague. And so when I left my last job, I got this beautiful book with all of these wishes and everything written. And there is one piece in there that I think would say what I want to say about my own reputation. So if that's okay, I will, yes. Dear Susan, it's been 3 years and 6 months, almost to the day, since you took me under your wing as my line manager. You've had an enormous influence and impact, not only on my professional growth, but also on the way I see myself and my place in this world. After many, many hours of talking, laughing, ranting, crying, moments of complete silence and brainstorming on how we can be better catalysts for change and progress, what is left to say? All I know is every place of work needs a Susan. Someone who sees the big picture when everyone else is concerned with only their own corner. Someone with infectious energy and drive to scale the obstacles when the rest have grown weary and given up hope. Someone who is willing to have the difficult conversations, but always makes sure the subject's dignity and humanity is first priority. Someone who will make the tough decisions when no one else is willing to or even sees that it is needed. Someone whose door is open to anyone, everyone, despite title or rank. Someone whose integrity is more important than their ego. Wherever you go next, they are so lucky to be getting the original Susan.
Oh, so beautiful.
Oh, I cried.
I'm sure. I'm getting a bit
this morning.
Teary.
And I read back over some of that book, and it just like warmth, I think, Charlotte, is what comes out a lot, and humour, and the ability to be professional and personal.
Yeah, which speaks to your book and it speaks to the work you do, but coming at it with my communicator's eye, what it also speaks to is that the reputational gap happens when words and actions don't meet. So if we have leaders who go, oh, I'm all about transparency, or I'm all about psychological safety, say whatever you think and it's safe with me. And then when you act in that way, they behave differently. And what it sounds like to me, how your team members experienced you, was that absolute matching of words and action. So your reputation completely safe.
I hope so. And that was always my intention, Charlotte, that what you saw is what you got. And of course, I've had like run-ins with people over the years and whatever, but I also grew and learnt from that. And I think that's it. It's always about growth, isn't it? And reflection. I think reflection is one of the biggest gifts you can give yourself to further your own growth in life.
Yeah, and that's why coaching's so important, isn't it? Sometimes I hear people say, oh, everybody in their 50s is training to become a coach. There's so many coaches. We have a glut of coaches, and potentially true, but also it's a service to people who need some hand-holding in the self-reflection process.
And there's something about having your words witnessed as well, Charlotte. Like, I've done a lot of being coached over the years, and when someone listens to you non-judgmentally and you voice something maybe you've held on to for a long time, you hear, what am I thinking that for? But they don't judge you for it and allow you to kind of have a new thought. And I think there's something so powerful about that.
Yeah, there really is. So my priority with writing We Need New Leaders was to address and try to change the old school style of leadership, which shows up in physical form, but it also shows up in our own neuroscience, to take us back to the start of the podcast. So in our brains, we see leadership as loud, room owning, potentially male, comes in a suit, owns things, command and control. And I think the world deserves better. I think we deserve a better archetype of leadership. So in order to then achieve better leadership overall. So my question to you is, what can we do both collectively and individually to change that archetype we have in our heads?
It's so interesting, Charlotte. There is this question that I pose sometimes, and it's like there's a son and a father in an accident, and they get rushed to the hospital, and the son is on the operating table, and the surgeon says, I can't operate on this child, it's my son. Why is that? And I'm hoping you got...
I do know. It's because it's the surgeon is the mother.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you ask that question, if you don't know the answer, it takes people ages to figure it out. There's also like the father came back from the dead, or the father wasn't injured, and it's all of like, so we just have this fixed mindset that isn't our fault. We've inherited it. We've seen examples of it and so on. So I suppose the first thing we can do, Charlotte, is believe in ourselves and believe that we can make a change, that a new leader, that I can be that new leader. And we can do that individually and collectively. We can demand better, which brings me to the second point, which is every voice counts. Yeah. Every voice counts. And most of us keep ourselves silent because we don't believe our voice counts, because we're not loud, or we haven't thought up something amazing new. But oftentimes it's the basics that make for the best leaders. And there's something about us being silently complicit then, when we don't allow space for every voice to be heard, or encourage people to speak up when we think they've got something to say. And I don't mean just talking for the sake of it. I mean using your voice for what it's for. And through history, we have incredible examples of quiet people with something to say who made change in the world. And I firmly believe that can be any of us.
Oh, it's such a beautiful answer, and you so neatly mention, speak to my main points in We Need New Leaders, which is reputation, diversity, and leadership, and that message that every voice counts is so powerful. So, to the three questions I always ask, give us a book recommendation.
Well, you can't imagine, I'm sure you can imagine how hard this was. And actually, I have two. And the first one was actually my second one, but I'm just going to show it first, which is 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, which is by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And people, it's a lovely little read. It all honestly is. And it's been called Neuroscience for the Beach. So she really breaks down how our brains work. And I think if any of this stuff resonated today, it's a really helpful one if you'd like to know more. Of course, if you're not going to read my book. And the other book is The Art of Possibility by the Zanders, Benjamin Zander and Rosamund Stone Zander. And I just love, I'm possibilities person. I'm always looking for what's the possibility here, where are the possibilities. And the thing I think I love most about this book is he basically tells us everything's invented. So if everything is invented, then what stops you from inventing something? We don't have to conform to what's there in front of us. Of course, sometimes we do to certain things, like we don't want to commit murder, for example. But there's so much scope for us to use our brains and our deeper intelligence as well. I kind of think of the formula of courage and curiosity equals possibilities. And that's all we need often is...
Oh, that's so lovely. And those are two books that are definitely going on my list for sure. So, Susan, my mission with the podcast, but also with the book, is to inspire emerging leaders to confidently step into leadership roles, use their voice, be courageous, use the art of the possible. What 3 tips would you give emerging leaders from diverse backgrounds, diverse identities, and underrepresented minorities to really land, keep, or create their dream leadership roles?
So I would say, firstly, well, it's back to believing in yourself. You are as entitled as anyone else in the world to be in the position you're in. And you might not feel like you belong or you fit in, but you do belong. And don't worry too much about it, because I think most people don't feel like they fit in at points and all of those things. So I think focus on your strengths and what you bring. Personal responsibility, Charlotte, back to that again. I think take responsibility for your career aspirations, for your personal and professional growth. Don't rely on others seeing in you what you hope they see. Just bring that to the table. And there's just one of you in the world, just one. So make the most of it. And that comes to when you make mistakes, take responsibility. When you've done something and someone else is taking credit for it, take the responsibility and fight for your credit as well, that kind of thing. And I suppose the last thing I'd say, Charlotte, probably is know your values, know where you align with an organization you wish to go to, or know when something rubs up against it and what you're willing to compromise or not. And if you're not willing to compromise that, then find someone that can listen to you or figure out what it is. Because I think our emotions and our thoughts, these kind of clashes give us information. Figure out what that information is. Don't ignore it.
Those are 3 wonderful tips. Thank you so much. And last question. The world is sometimes a bit dark, sometimes a bit difficult. What brings you joy?
So much. And I kind of made a shift a few years ago of seeking joy, because I think we can seek joy every day. So for me, it's very simple. If I can see a sunset or sunrise. Now today it's absolutely clouded over, and I went out to the supermarket and I just saw this little patch of blue in the sky, and I just was like, it's brilliant. The sea. I'm a big outdoors person, but the sea brings me incredible joy. Reading and walking alongside people and seeing shining eyes. I mean, that brings me a lot of joy.
What a beautiful answer, and what an insightful and lovely conversation. Susan Ní Chríodáin, thank you for joining me on Speech Bubbles.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was lovely.